The Eastern Front was forever scarred by the catastrophe of Stalingrad in early 1943. The brutal winter had temporarily halted the relentless momentum of the German Wehrmacht. Both sides were licking grievous wounds, desperately seeking a pause to rebuild their shattered armies. The strategic initiative, once firmly in Hitler's hands, had begun to slip away into the vastness of the Russian plains. Hitler remained fundamentally convinced that a single, devastating blow could still retrieve the fortunes of the Reich. He believed the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse and lacked the resilience for another major offensive. This period of relative calm was merely the tense drawing of breath before the most colossal armored clash in human history. The Great Soviet Counteroffensive had created a massive, inviting bulge, a tempting target for German strategic planners. This geographic anomaly, known as the Kursk salient, became the focal point of Hitler's desperate attention. His military staff were already drafting plans for a decisive summer offensive to eliminate this dangerous Soviet foothold. The hope was to repeat the earlier successes of encirclement, trapping and destroying vast Red Army forces within the pocket. This victory would stabilize the front line and free up vital divisions for deployment elsewhere in the increasingly stretched war effort. The Führer was placing his entire faith in the latest technological marvels produced by German industry. New, powerful tanks like the Panther and the heavily armored Tiger were seen as the perfect instruments for this overwhelming assault. He envisioned a quick, sharp, surgical operation that would shatter the Soviet will to fight before autumn arrived. The immense scale of the impending confrontation was something the world had never witnessed before or since. It was a quiet before a storm that would ultimately decide the war's fate in the East. The fate of millions hung precariously on the decisions made in the dimly lit command bunkers far from the front lines. The Soviet command, however, was neither blind nor unprepared for this coming onslaught. Their intelligence network was already providing crucial details about the German timetable and intentions. This rare advantage fundamentally altered the nature of the upcoming battle from a German surprise attack to a massive Soviet counterambush. The ground was firming up after the spring thaw, making the endless steppes ripe for a new, massive tank battle. This lull was merely a deceptive calm before the final, earth-shaking confrontation for supremacy in Eastern Europe. The stage was set for a showdown that would define the rest of the Second World War. Adolf Hitler, increasingly detached and relying on personal intuition, saw the Kursk salient as a necessary, decisive target. He was plagued by the memory of the German failure at Stalingrad and desperately needed a victory to restore his prestige. The plan, codenamed Operation Citadel, was intended to slice off the massive bulge using converging attacks from the north and south. Field Marshal von Manstein and others cautioned against a frontal assault, advocating for a more mobile, fluid defense. Hitler, however, overruled their objections, insisting on a massive, overwhelming tank force to ensure a swift breakthrough. He believed that sheer material power could still overcome the inherent strategic disadvantages of the attack. The Führer's insistence on delaying the operation became one of the most critical errors in German military planning. He postponed the assault from May to July to wait for the newest Panther tanks to arrive in sufficient numbers. This 2-month delay was a strategic gift to the Red Army, which they immediately seized with both hands. The Soviets used every single day of the reprieve to fortify their positions with a chilling, unprecedented thoroughness. Hitler's obsession with technological perfection blinded him to the rapidly closing window of opportunity. He failed to appreciate the Red Army's capability to rebuild, re-equip, and learn from its previous crushing defeats. The vast spaces of the Soviet Union had been swallowing German offensives for 2 long years. The German reserves were dwindling with every passing month, making this attack an all-or-nothing proposition. A failure at Kursk would irrevocably commit the Wehrmacht to a strategic defense for the remainder of the war. The concentration of forces for Citadel was immense, comprising the best equipped and most experienced German panzer divisions. This represented the last major armored reserve the German Reich could effectively field on the Eastern Front. The weight of this final, desperate offensive was meant to be crushing and irresistible. Hitler viewed the Soviets as a brittle foe who would collapse once their front line was decisively breached. His rigid, often irrational, command style began to suffocate the professional judgment of his senior field commanders. The entire German military machine was now geared towards the success of this single, massive operation. The political imperative for victory overshadowed the cold, brutal realities of the logistical situation. The decision to delay Citadel transformed a potential surprise into a fully anticipated and meticulously prepared battle. This colossal gamble represented the final moment when Germany could still dictate the strategic tempo of the war in the East. The Battle of Kharkov in early 1943 had successfully stabilized the southern sector of the Eastern Front for the Germans. However, the subsequent Soviet winter counteroffensive had created the massive 60-mile deep bulge around the city of Kursk. This great salient jutted precariously into the German lines, making it a tempting but deadly geographical feature. It was a natural target for a German pincer movement, but it also offered a perfect opportunity for a Soviet defensive trap. The northern face of the salient was held by the Soviet Central Front under Konstantin Rokossovsky. The southern face was defended by the Voronezh Front, commanded by Nikolai Vatutin. The Red Army Command, Stavka, immediately recognized the strategic significance and inherent danger of the salient. They correctly predicted that Hitler would attempt to cut off and destroy the forces inside this exposed position. The Soviet High Command made the momentous decision not to launch their own immediate offensive. Instead, they decided to lure the Germans into a massive, prepared defense, bleeding the Panzer forces dry. This was a radical departure from their traditional doctrine of immediate, head-on counterattacks. It was a strategic masterstroke that utilized the Germans' predictable appetite for encirclement. The Soviet forces began constructing the most elaborate and deepest defensive system ever seen in warfare. The depth of the defenses was astonishing, reaching up to 150 miles in some key sectors. 6 main defensive belts were laid down, one behind the other, designed to halt any deep armored penetration. These belts were not merely trenches. They were complex zones featuring minefields, anti-tank ditches, and fortified positions. The sheer density of anti-tank weaponry and concealed artillery was intended to create a killing zone for the German tanks. Behind the main defenses lay 2 massive reserve fronts, ready to launch a powerful counteroffensive once the German attack stalled. The Soviet logistical effort to move millions of mines and countless tons of earth was a monumental feat of wartime engineering. The soil of the Kursk region was transformed into a deadly, multi-layered gauntlet for the advancing German armor. Every farm field and every copse of trees was meticulously surveyed, and turned into a pre-sighted fire zone. This transformation of the landscape from open steppe to fortified citadel occurred entirely during Hitler's self-imposed delay. The physical terrain itself was now actively working against the German goal of a quick, decisive breakthrough. The salient was no longer a weak point, but a heavily armored fist waiting to smash the German invasion. The critical delay in launching Operation Citadel was directly attributable to Hitler's fervent desire for the new Panther tank. The Panther was intended to be the decisive weapon, a perfect blend of mobility, protection, and firepower. Its powerful long-barreled 75 mm gun could easily penetrate the armor of the Soviet T-34 at long range. However, the tanks were rushed into production and suffered from significant mechanical teething problems. The initial batches were notoriously unreliable, prone to engine fires, and suffered frequent transmission failures. German command believed they needed at least 800 operational Panther tanks to guarantee the operation's success. This requirement pushed the start date back from May through June and finally into the heat of early July 1943. The delay was argued over fiercely in the German High Command, with seasoned generals warning of the dangers of procrastination. Field Marshal Guderian, Inspector General of the Armored Troops, argued forcefully against using the unproven tanks in such a critical assault. He famously stated that the offensive should be canceled altogether or launched immediately without waiting for the new equipment. Hitler dismissed these warnings, convinced that the shock of the new weaponry would justify the operational pause. This waiting game allowed the Soviets to plant an estimated 1 million anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. The Red Army also moved immense reinforcements into the salient, dramatically shifting the balance of forces. The intelligence flow to the Soviets, known as the Lucy espionage network, confirmed every detail of the German plans and delays. Stavka was able to plot the German axis of advance with near-perfect accuracy thanks to this intelligence. The element of surprise, which is vital for any successful offensive, was entirely lost by the time Citadel began. The concentration of German armor, while massive, was also plainly visible from the air and easily tracked by Soviet reconnaissance. The delay meant the German attack would commence in the height of the summer heat, worsening the already strained supply lines. The hard-baked ground would not offer the same mobility advantages as the spring or late autumn weather. The 2-month hiatus essentially negated the numerical and technological edge that the German tanks were supposed to provide. The Soviet defensive system became a complex maze, perfectly prepared to absorb the shock of the German assault. The confidence Hitler placed in the Panther's arrival was tragically misplaced, as mechanical breakdown claimed many before combat. The strategic cost of waiting for an unready weapon became one of the defining failures of the campaign. The Soviet decision to go on the defensive first at Kursk was a profound strategic turning point in the entire war. General Georgy Zhukov, a brilliant and ruthless commander, was instrumental in shaping the defensive strategy. He correctly understood that the key was not to match the German tanks blow for blow, but to break their momentum. The goal was to wear down the elite Panzer divisions against a concrete and steel wall before committing the Soviet reserves. Zhukov authorized the construction of a defense system unlike anything the world had ever seen, built on immense depth. The defense was organized into a succession of belts, each designed to slow, isolate, and destroy advancing enemy units. The first belt contained a staggering density of anti-tank minefields, designed to force the German tanks into predictable channels. Behind the mines, the first line of trenches and dug-in anti-tank artillery waited to engage the surviving vehicles. The total density of the minefields exceeded 4,000 anti-tank mines and 5,000 anti-personnel mines per mile of front in key sectors. The Red Army also utilized the collective effort of the civilian population to dig the massive anti-tank ditches and trenches. The human effort involved in constructing this immense defensive barrier was truly colossal and inspiring. Soviet intelligence played a crucial role in correctly identifying the primary axes of attack, allowing for maximum concentration of defenses. The Soviets had concentrated over 1.3 million troops, 3,600 tanks, and 20,000 artillery pieces within the salient. The sheer scale of this preparation ensured that no single German breakthrough could achieve a strategic objective. The Soviet forces held massive strategic reserves, most notably the entire 5th Guards Tank Army, positioned well behind the front. This army was earmarked for the counterattack, waiting patiently for the German armored spearheads to become exhausted and vulnerable. The air defenses were also significantly strengthened, challenging the Luftwaffe's previous dominance over the battlefield. Zhukov's plan was a study in patience, letting the enemy commit his forces fully before unleashing the crushing Soviet response. The defensive masterpiece at Kursk ensured that the German army would be attacking not a line, but a massive, steel-reinforced fortress. This strategic patience was an attribute the Soviet military had learned the hard way through years of brutal fighting. The Soviets had built a defense so deep that a successful breakthrough of the first line was only the start of the German nightmare. The Soviet preparation for Operation Citadel was not just a matter of digging trenches. It was a race against time and an engineering marvel. Millions of tons of earth were moved by hand, shovel, and horse-drawn cart to create the immense defensive works. The deep, camouflaged artillery positions were designed to unleash a torrent of fire onto pre-planned German advance routes. Every square kilometer of the forward area was pre-registered by multiple Soviet artillery batteries for devastating effect. The infantry was trained specifically for close-quarter anti-tank combat, using Molotov cocktails and magnetic mines. These desperate measures were necessary to counter the superior armor of the German Tiger and Panther tanks. Soviet propaganda bolstered the morale of the troops, framing the battle as the decisive struggle for the motherland. The defensive lines were interconnected by an extensive network of field communication cables and supply roads. These vital arteries ensured that units could be resupplied and reserves could be moved rapidly to any threatened sector. The focus on engineering and logistics was a direct result of lessons learned from the disastrous German advances of 1941 and 1942. The Red Army ensured that their tanks were dug in and camouflaged, using them as stationary anti-tank bunkers. This tactic denied the superior German tanks the open-field maneuverability they needed to dominate the fight. The meticulous Soviet preparation included extensive dummy fortifications and false equipment to confuse German aerial reconnaissance. German intelligence consistently overestimated the Soviet forces and misidentified the true location of the deep reserves. This successful deception added another layer of complexity to the already daunting task facing the German field commanders. The Soviet troops spent months enduring the constant threat of German bombing and artillery while working day and night. Their dedication transformed the flat, unassuming steppe into a landscape of deadly, hidden obstacles. The sheer scale of the anti-tank mine belts was the single greatest psychological and physical deterrent to the Panzer divisions. Mines forced the German vehicles to halt or slow down, making them easy targets for the concealed Soviet guns. The Red Army's logistical infrastructure was now focused entirely on the massive task of holding the line at Kursk. The preparation ensured that the Germans would encounter a defensive obstacle far greater than they had ever faced before. Every soldier understood that the fate of the war rested on the strength and depth of their dug-in positions. The meticulous readiness of the Red Army nullified Hitler's gamble even before the first shot was fired in anger. Operation Citadel was finally launched on the 5th of July, 1943, under the cover of a massive German artillery barrage. The pre-dawn quiet was shattered by the roar of thousands of guns, intended to soften the Soviet defensive positions. The German attack was immediately met by a devastating counter-barrage from the Soviet artillery. This preemptive Soviet fire, based on the superb intelligence of German attack timing, inflicted heavy losses on the German assembly areas. The main German effort was concentrated in the southern sector, led by the elite Panzer divisions of the 4th Panzer Army. The spearhead was formed by the 2 SS Panzer Corps, featuring the deadly Tiger tanks and the new, untested Panthers. The German armored columns soon bogged down in the vast, dense Soviet minefields. The advance was slowed to a crawl, forcing engineers to clear paths under intense Soviet mortar and artillery fire. The Soviet anti-tank guns, perfectly sighted, began to exact a heavy toll on the immobilized German tanks. The German tanks, designed for maneuver warfare, were forced to fight a static, close-quarters battle they were ill-suited for. Despite the heavy resistance, the sheer mass and quality of the German armor allowed them to punch through the first defensive belt. The initial days of the battle were a brutal grind, with the German forces suffering significant, irreplaceable losses. The new Panther tanks, intended as the decisive weapon, proved vulnerable to breakdown and fire in the harsh environment. Many Panthers failed before reaching the main battle lines, succumbing to transmission failures and engine troubles. The German commanders were forced to commit their reserves much earlier than planned to sustain the initial momentum. The Soviet Air Force, VVS, also rose to the challenge, battling the Luftwaffe for aerial supremacy over the salient. The continuous dogfights and ground attack sorties added another layer of destruction to the already chaotic battlefield. The sheer attrition of men and material began immediately, with casualties mounting rapidly on both sides. The German war machine, having successfully fought its way through the first line, found itself immediately confronted by the second. The promised quick victory was already becoming a costly, agonizingly slow battle of grinding attrition. The German advance was measured not in miles, but in yards, paid for with the wreck of tanks and the lives of elite troops. Hitler's dream of a swift encirclement was dissolving into a nightmare of endless Soviet resistance and fire. The battle quickly devolved into ferocious, localized fights where individual tank crews and anti-tank teams became heroes or casualties. The Soviet infantry, often underestimated, proved to be tenacious and skilled in the defense of their trenches. They let the German armor roll over their positions and then emerged to attack the supporting infantry and supply lines from the rear. This infiltration disrupted the vital communication and coordination that German combined arms operations relied upon. The Soviet forces excelled at utilizing their dug-in anti-tank artillery, most notably the ZIS 376 mm field gun. These inexpensive and ubiquitous guns fired from concealed positions, ambushing the German tanks at close range. The tactics relied on firing at the vulnerable sides and rear of the heavier German tanks after they had passed the main line. The Red Army also employed specialized anti-tank rifle teams, which, while ineffective against the Tiger's frontal armor, harassed lighter vehicles. The relentless pressure on the German flanks prevented the converging armies from ever truly linking up. In the northern sector, the German Ninth Army struggled against the Central Front, achieving only a shallow penetration. Rokossovsky's Central Front was expertly managed, using its deep defenses to absorb the blow and contain the German advance. The difficult terrain and the constant threat of counterattacks further hampered the northern German offensive. The northern attack was decisively halted after a few days, having failed to break through even the second defensive line. This failure meant that the southern assault would have to succeed alone, carrying the entire weight of Operation Citadel. The German southern thrust continued to push deeper, but every mile was a victory for the Soviet attrition strategy. The Germans were drawn further and further into the pre-planned killing zones, consuming their strength with every passing hour. The Soviet tactic of drawing the panzers into the trenches reduced the German technological advantage to almost zero. When German tanks were forced to maneuver among the ditches, their speed and long-range guns were rendered useless. The battle became a messy, brutal slugfest, contrary to the fast, clean war of movement Hitler had envisioned. The Soviet tank-killing teams were the unsung heroes, holding the line with grim determination and tactical cleverness. The most famous engagement of the Battle of Kursk took place near the small village of Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943. The 2 SS Panzer Corps, having successfully breached several Soviet lines, was moving towards the Sel River and Prokhorovka. Stavka responded by committing its colossal, waiting strategic reserve, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army. This clash resulted in the largest concentration of armored forces in a single battle in military history. It was a true tank-on-tank brawl, a chaotic melee fought at extremely close range across the dusty, open steppe. The Soviet commanders deliberately closed the distance to negate the superior range and armor of the German Tiger and Panther tanks. In the confused, close-quarters fighting, the Soviet T-34s could maneuver to hit the vulnerable flanks and rear of the heavier German armor. The air was thick with the smell of burning oil, cordite, and the metallic tang of exploding shells. Hundreds of tanks were engaged in a swirling, confusing battle with visibility reduced by the dust and smoke of explosions. Both sides claimed victory in the immediate aftermath, but the strategic consequences clearly favored the Soviet side. The battle itself was a tactical draw, with both armies suffering devastating losses in the tank-heavy confrontation. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army was severely mauled, losing a significant portion of its total armor. However, the German 2 SS Panzer Corps was stopped dead in its tracks and had its attacking power irreversibly blunted. The engagement at Prokhorovka robbed the Germans of the final operational momentum needed to achieve a strategic breakthrough. The German spearhead was no longer able to advance and was forced onto the defensive almost immediately after the battle concluded. The tank graveyard at Prokhorovka marked the high-water mark of the German offensive power on the Eastern Front. It was the final, devastating exchange that left the Germans strategically bankrupt and unable to continue the attack. The tremendous Soviet losses were acceptable because they had achieved the crucial strategic goal of stopping the enemy advance. The Red Army still possessed massive reserves, while the losses to the German panzer divisions were practically irreplaceable. The sheer scale of the wreckage at Prokhorovka testified to the ferocity and desperation of the fighting. The decisive strategic development that doomed Operation Citadel did not occur on the vast Russian steppe. It came from the sunny Mediterranean in the form of the Allied invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky. American and British forces landed on the Italian island on July 10, 1943, just 5 days after Citadel's launch. The invasion immediately raised the specter of Italy's collapse and the opening of an entire new front in southern Europe. Hitler was forced to make an agonizing decision that fundamentally undercut the entire rationale of the Kursk offensive. He decided to halt Operation Citadel on July 13th, ordering a significant portion of his armored reserves to be transferred to Italy. The most potent German attack, the 2 SS Panzer Corps, was pulled out of the Soviet Union to stabilize the crumbling Mediterranean front. The withdrawal was a devastating blow to the German field commanders at Kursk, who felt a final breakthrough was still possible. Manstein, commanding the southern thrust, pleaded with Hitler to be allowed to continue the battle to its decisive conclusion. He argued that the Soviet reserves were also spent and that a final push could still trap the defending Soviet armies. Hitler, consumed by the crisis in Italy, refused to listen and prioritized the defense of the Axis heartland. This decision confirmed the failure of the German strategy and handed the strategic victory entirely to the Soviets. The withdrawal signaled an irreversible shift of the strategic initiative from the German to the Soviet side. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht would be fighting an almost continuous defensive war on the Eastern Front. The commitment of vast resources to a new theater proved that Hitler could no longer focus solely on the destruction of the Soviet Union. The Battle of Kursk was abandoned not due to total defeat, but due to a desperate, unmanageable strategic overextension. The immense concentration of German might, intended to deliver a final, knockout blow, was dispersed across 2 fronts. The need to defend Italy exposed the growing inability of Germany to fight a war on multiple, massive fronts simultaneously. The Allied landing in Sicily served as the perfect strategic distraction, permanently relieving the pressure on the Red Army. The order to withdraw from the Kursk salient marked the end of Germany's capacity to mount major offensive operations in the east. The strategic withdrawal was a necessary but demoralizing operation for the battered panzer divisions. German forces began pulling back, leaving behind the immense battlefield of wrecked tanks and shattered landscapes. The Red Army immediately seized the initiative, transitioning from a stubborn defense to a massive counteroffensive. The Soviet armies, which had patiently held their powerful reserves, now unleashed their full might. Rokossovsky's Central Front attacked in the north, while Vatutin's Voronezh Front launched their counterattack in the south. The Soviets quickly overwhelmed the tired and depleted German forces that were attempting to cover the retreat. The German units were no longer fighting for encirclement, but desperately trying to hold a crumbling defensive line. The counterattacks, codenamed Operation Kutuzov in the north and Operation Polkovodets Rumiantsev in the south, were hugely successful. The Soviets rapidly advanced, recapturing the cities of Orel and Belgorod, which flanked the Kursk salient. The fighting was bitter and costly, but the direction of the war had fundamentally changed, becoming a permanent Soviet advance. The German armies were forced to retreat back to the line of the Dnieper River, a major strategic natural barrier. The losses suffered in Operation Citadel were crippling and could not be replaced by the struggling German industry. The destruction of hundreds of elite tanks and the loss of tens of thousands of experienced tank crews proved irreversible. Hitler's greatest strength, the Panzer divisions, was broken against the layered defenses of the Red Army at Kursk. The German military was now permanently relegated to a defensive posture, focused only on slowing the inevitable Soviet advance. The strategic consequences of the failed offensive were far-reaching and immediately apparent across the entire Eastern Front. The initiative passed entirely to Stavka, which could now choose the time and place of every major engagement. The withdrawal was a painful acknowledgement that the German dream of conquering the Soviet Union was irrevocably over. The Battle of Kursk stands as the single most important strategic victory for the Soviet Union in the entire Second World War. It officially ended the era of German offensive capability on the Eastern Front, securing the initiative for the Red Army. The staggering scale of the German defeat in terms of lost strategic potential was far greater than the raw casualty numbers suggest. Germany had committed its last great reserve of manpower and armor, only to see it shattered against a prepared defense. The Soviet victory was a triumph of intelligence, defensive engineering, strategic patience, and overwhelming firepower. The battle permanently altered the balance of power, ensuring that the war of attrition would now favor the Soviet Union. Hitler's flawed insistence on delay and his over-reliance on a single, new tank cemented the failure of the operation. The vast, open steppe around Kursk became the site of the greatest tank graveyard in history, a monument to German hubris. The failure forced the Germans into a long, agonizing retreat across the vast distances of the Soviet Union. The Red Army, now confident and better equipped, began a relentless westward drive that would eventually end in Berlin. Kursk proved that the German military machine was not invincible and that Soviet command was tactically superior in defense. The myth of the all-conquering Panzer division was finally and definitively broken in the dusty fields of central Russia. The vast losses of material meant the German economy would struggle to keep pace with the combined might of the Allies. The world witnessed a clear signal that the tide of the war had irreversibly turned against Nazi Germany. The battle marked the true start of the final push towards the Reich, the great steamroller of the Red Army gaining momentum. The consequences of the tanks dying in the fire at Kursk echoed across every front, from Italy to the skies over Germany. Hitler's last great gamble for a quick victory resulted in a slow, grinding strategic defeat that hastened the war's conclusion. The Battle of Kursk was not merely a battle. It was the hinge upon which the entire Eastern Front turned towards inevitable German defeat.